Well, hello again everyone. Hope you're all having a great weekend, enjoying the sunshine if you have it. I know it's quite warm here in the Range Rover, but it's the only quiet space that I can find to shoot the videos for you. My most recent question comes from Harry Walshaw, who has asked me to cover front wheel drive weight transfer on tarmac. I'm probably going to take it 10 steps further and look at all drivetrain types and all of the internal, what I class as the internal influencing factors. These are all the things that the car itself, in how it's laid out, where the engine is, how the tyres are, the suspension setup, so on and so forth, can influence how effective a weight transfer is going to be, and some of the external factors, and then we'll put them all together, and hopefully this separation in different drivetrain types and different surface types will make more sense to each and every one of you, so I don't have to focus on each car and each surface specifically. You'll be able to make these decisions, these choices for yourself, because hopefully at the end of this video you'll understand them better. So let's have a look at it and see how this plays out. So one of the things that may come as a surprise to you is that regardless of what your drivetrain type is, be it front wheel drive, four wheel drive or rear wheel drive, the fundamentals of weight transfer remain exactly the same. And by that I mean, as you accelerate, the weight is always going to go to the rear. As you brake or slow down, the weight's always going to come to the front. And likewise, when you steer left and right, the weight is always going to shift the same way. However, there are differences in how you're manipulating the grip and the surface interaction around you, in how the wheels are driven, and that's what we're going to look at first, is how the driven wheels will influence how effective a weight transfer is going to be. So if we firstly take a look at rear wheel drive and how the rear wheels being driven influence a weight transfer technique. When you come off the power and turn in a rear wheel drive car, you're passing the weight over the front wheels, which makes the front wheels bite into that ground a little bit harder, but they offer no other resistance in the way that they're not driven. They're on freely rotating bearings. The only other resistance they offer would be the condition of the bearings themselves, the rolling resistance between the tyre and the surface that you're on, and the steered angle that you have selected at that moment, which is really what we're relying on to give us that anchor point, that moment to turn round. Okay, so if the front wheels have that extra bite, that extra little bit of grip compared to what the rear of the car has, we then have a pivot point, something for the car to rotate round. That's why I specified on the previous video, we don't use a large steering input. If you use a large steering input far too quickly, far too early in the turn, what happens there is you encourage an understeer, and if you've got an understeer, it's really hard to bring an oversteer into the equation unless you start using the handbrake, but by then you're obviously too deep into the bend. So at that moment that you come off the power and steer in, you're passing the weight to the front wheels. The crucial thing to remember here is that on a rear wheel drive car, the front wheels are not driven. They're not going to offer you any other further reduction in speed other than the rolling resistance and the steered angle that you've selected. At the rear end of the car then, what's happening at that moment where you lift and turn is that you're starting to take the grip away by passing the weight to the front of the car through the natural reduction in speed that the car has at that moment, but you're also removing the speed from the rear wheels. You're changing the torque at the rear tyres. Now the more engine braking, or depending on what gear you have selected at that particular moment in time, will influence how sharp that torque change at the rear wheels is. That torque change on its own in some cars is enough to lose traction at the rear. So the points to consider with a rear wheel drive car is the fact that you're slowing down onto the front wheels which are not driven, so front wheel grip here is crucial. And at the rear you have to take it into consideration that there's two elements that are going to lose traction for you. One is the weight transfer, and another is the torque change at the rear, which is very different to what you'd experience in a front wheel drive car. So what you'd experience in a weight transfer technique in a front wheel drive car is very different to that of a rear wheel drive car, and the main thing is, again, down to the driven wheels. As you come off the power, you're still going to pass the weight to the front, so you're still going to be pushing those front wheels into the ground that little bit harder and removing the grip from the rear by making the rear of the car that little bit lighter. However, when you come off the power and turn in the front wheel drive car, you're being assisted by continuing engine braking, the thing that you didn't have in a rear wheel drive car. Okay, so in this scenario, in the front wheel drive car, when you come off the power and you're steering in the direction you want the car to rotate, not only are the front wheels getting more grip, they're also continuing to slow the car down in through that weight transfer. So they're assisting you in that weight transfer, and they're also assisting you in the direction change, because the front wheels are continually driven through the maneuver. As you steer in the direction that you want the car to turn, the front wheels are going to actually be pulling you in that direction, which really helps you turn in. So when it comes to having a sharp response to a weight transfer, front wheel drive will usually have a much sharper turn in than a rear wheel drive, purely because how the driven wheels are laid out. Okay, so the other thing to bear in mind here is that the gear that you select, much the same in a rear wheel drive car, there is an influence there from the drivetrain too. If you have a very low gear selected at the moment you want the car to start turning in, where you have that lift and turn, you may find that the gear that you're in will be too sharp. That torque change might be too much, and you'll start then to understeer rather than turn in. If you want the car to turn in a very low grip surface, you want the car to be in a fairly high gear, so that as you lift off, that reduction in speed, that change in torque isn't so sharp, and you don't lose that grip straight away, and that weight transfer happens far more progressively. Just remember what I said in the previous video, that you will have ample time during a weight transfer technique to change gear if you need to. Take advantage of that. You know, if you're going in a low grip surface with a front wheel drive car to initiate a weight transfer, remember it's that front wheel grip that you're dependent on. You need the front wheels to bite if you want any chance of the back end of the car coming around for you. It's pivotal on that, and no pun intended. The front wheels are your pivot. Okay, so if you come in too low a gear and lift off the power, that sudden torque change at the front wheels can be enough to remove the grip that you need to actually get the car to change direction. Much the same as what I said with putting too much steering in. Put too much steering in, especially on a front wheel drive car, and you will encourage an understeer, because you've got many forces acting on those front wheels. The fact that they're driven will also influence how much steering angle you can put on. In fact, in a front wheel drive car, or a four wheel drive car for that matter, the steering angle should be smaller than what you have on a rear wheel drive car, because you don't need that same level of steering to get the desired output. And this is one of the reasons, because you're slowing the car down onto the front wheels, which are also driven, which really do assist you in that turn in. So front wheel drive car, much sharper turn in, and the difference in the between the front and the rear wheel drive car is that you haven't got that torque change at the rear. All that's happening at the rear of the car there is that you're losing grip because of the weight transfer, nothing more. So how will four wheel drive be different? So four-wheel drive really gets the best of both worlds, because you have the front wheels and the rear wheels driven. You can see how already probably the elements are going to work out here. So when you lift and turn in your four-wheel drive car, you're slowing the car down onto the front wheels, which are continuing to slow you down because they're driven. And at the same time, up at the back end, the back wheels are starting to have less grip because you're removing the weight away, but at the same time they're continuing to slow down, which that torque change helps the back of the car break free. So you combine the elements of the front wheel drive and the rear wheel drive car there to come up with an all-round better system, really, at getting the car to manipulate a weight transfer, or certainly utilize the weight transfer to its advantage. Okay, so four-wheel drive out of the three drivetrains really does make the best use of the weight transfer at that particular moment, and how each of the three drivetrains interact with the weight transfer from that point on, from the initiation of the slide, is very different depending on how the drivetrains are laid out. Now, with a rear wheel drive car, you need to use the power to continue the turn. With a front wheel drive car, if you try and use the power to continue the turn, you'll usually end up in a ditch. With a four-wheel drive car, it really comes down to how the diffs are and how the drivetrain is laid out between the front and the rear, what the torque split is. If you have a rear bias drivetrain, you will get away with adding power in here, but if you're more of a 50-50 split, then the likelihood is that you will induce an understeer. So having that knowledge of what to do and when is really important, and it's certainly more information that I can add perhaps in another video. So hopefully you can see there that the driven wheels alone will influence how effective a weight transfer technique will be at the moment that you want the car to change direction. What we're going to look at now are all the other little things that will have an influence over how effective the car will turn in at that moment, or certainly the rate at which the car will turn in at that particular moment, and hopefully that will make more sense as well and add more weight to what we've done already. So one of the technical elements within the vehicle itself that will alter the rate at which a weight transfer will carry out will be the wheelbase itself, the distance between the front and the rear wheels. The longer the wheelbase, the harder it is to initiate a weight transfer, and certainly the longer it will take to complete your turn. The shorter the wheelbase, the easier it is to initiate the weight transfer, the easier it is to shift the weight from the rear to the front, and the less time it will take to complete your turn. So if you think what I'm saying there is that the further away your rear wheels are, the larger the arc, the more distance they need to cover to change that same amount of degrees, you know, between where you are now and the exit of your turn, be it 90, 180 degrees. If you have a short wheelbase car, it takes less distance for the rears to come round, and if you've got a long wheelbase car, it takes much longer. They have to cover a much longer distance, so that the turn itself can actually change in speed and not just initiation, depending on how long your wheelbase is. Weight distribution is also a massive factor. So if you think about how cars are laid out, I'll give you a rear-wheel drive example here very quickly. If you have a front engine rear-wheel drive car, it's obviously going to be much easier to get the car to break into a weight transfer slide than what if you had a rear engine, like a 911, something like that. A rear engine rear-wheel drive car, you need to use a lot more effort and a lot more energy to get the car to respond to this particular style of turn, by comparison to if the engine was at the front, and that's purely down to how the weight distribution in the car itself is laid out. So changes in weight as well as wheelbase will have a huge difference or a huge influence as to how effective or how much energy you need to get the weight transfer technique to work for you. So the next one's fairly obvious, and that's tyre choice. Now, we know that what we're trying to achieve with the weight transfer is a difference in traction between the front and the rear of the car, enough so that the car will break into a slide. And you can already see, I suppose, that if your front tyres are offering less grip than what's at the rear, the moment you're trying to change direction, the tyres are already fighting against you. So there's two things here to consider, would be, in fact, maybe three things when it comes to tyres. One would be pressures, you know, thinking about the difference in pressures between the front and the rear of the car, because they will influence how much traction you have. The tyre compound type itself, how sticky those tyres are. So if your front tyres are perhaps on a slightly less sticky compound to the rear, why you would ever set the car up in that way, I'm not so sure, but it's already fighting against you. And the condition of the tyre itself, so if your front tyres have deteriorated to the point where they're not really turning in under neutral steer, regardless of any oversteer scenario here, that's probably the time where you want to start changing the front tyres out for a fresh set, so that you have that positive turn in. Without that positive turn in, it's really hard to break the car into an oversteer unless you start bringing the handbrake into play. So tyres are one of the other obvious influencing factors. So suspension setup in a car is absolutely crucial for an effective weight transfer setup. If you're going to utilize weight transfer quite a lot, you need the car in a position where it's able to move around on its suspension. You don't want it to be rigid. The movement in the suspension is crucial for you to be able to build up and store and then subsequently release energy in your favor when it comes to these weight transfer techniques. If your car is too rigid, it does two things. For one, it removes that facility for you to be able to build up and store energy. There's nowhere to store it. There's nowhere to build it up within the suspension, the movement within the car. And the other thing is, if there is, it happens over a very short period of time, so it takes a usable time frame away from you and makes things very difficult and very challenging. So any weight transfer that you do get from the car happens very quickly and very snappy, and that counts for the build up and store of energy. It'll happen very quickly and very snappy, and then when you're trying to release it, it'll happen very quickly. Now, if you're playing around on a low grip surface, for example, and your suspension's very stiff and very rigid, where you're trying to get the car to transfer weight onto the front to initiate your slide, it'll happen so fast, the chances are that it'll push the car on into an understeer, and you don't want that to happen. Whereas if you imagine the car is quite soft and supple, it'll gently squeeze that weight on at the nose of the car in a way that you're making better use of the grip, much in the same way as where I said earlier with the gear selections. If you're in a higher gear on the approach, you're going to make better use of the traction because the snappiness and the torque isn't there as what it would be in a lower gear. So try and always think that you want things to be soft and supple when you're trying to initiate the initial part of a weight transfer technique, and the only way you can achieve that with the suspension is to have that suppleness, that movement in the car. So I also mentioned earlier that we'd go over external influencing factors. Now, all of these are exactly the same as what they would have been in my previous video. Things like surface type, whether you're going uphill, downhill, weather conditions, all of these things are exactly the same. But to brush up on a couple there. So changes in grip, for example, if you've got a high grip surface, you're going to need more effort and more energy to get the car to move around for you. Same as if you're going uphill. If you're going uphill, you're fighting against gravity, and because that gravity is pushing you into the ground harder, in relation to how fast you're traveling and so on, you're going to need more effort, more energy going uphill because everything's fighting against you. If you're going downhill, you effectively have less grip, but you've also got the added benefit of gravity assisting you as well. So you need to use a lot less in the way of effort to start the slide and to get the car moving, but you also need to do less with the slide, mid-slide, because you've got gravity assisting you. So you have to change the whole mindset there, and that could be the same could be said for certain low grip surfaces as well. So all of these things work hand in hand with what we've discussed in this video, as in if you understand how the driven wheels and the weight distribution and the tire setup and the suspension setup and all of these things work hand in hand, and what they do when you're faced with these certain scenarios of increased or reduced grip, whether you're going uphill or downhill, they're all things you need to be thinking about. But for you to be thinking about them all the time when you're out on the stage is really hard to do, and it puts a lot of mental strain and a lot of mental effort on you. It's hard to think about it for every single corner, every time you need to use it. So this is why I say it's very important that you have opportunity to practice, to put these things into a system so that you can rehearse them and make sense of them to the point where it becomes second nature to you, so that you're doing it more of an instinctive response as a reaction, rather than having to think about it as you go round. But these things have to be built on sound knowledge and understanding, and it's very important you get that part of it correct, which is where I think people come and work with me directly on this. So if there's anything in the video that you're unsure of, you want to know more about it, use this as an opportunity. We've got plenty of free time. I'm certainly happy to do this. If you get in touch with me directly through messages, or if you want to speak to me directly, pick up the phone and give me a call. You find my number on the website and on the Facebook page. I don't have a problem with that, and I'd much rather that you had the information so you were out there actually targeting things that you need to make yourself understand and to progress and develop your driving better. I'd much rather you had that knowledge and that system in place at the start to build on, rather than just going out there and doing laps and making better use of your time and your money and your tires and everything else. So that's the whole purpose of that. And hopefully you found this video informative in the way that it adds more information to what we discussed before. There is still more information to do with weight transfer, but I don't want to make this too information heavy. I think we've covered enough there, as in difference in drivetrain, difference in wheelbase layout, we've got tire types and condition, we've got suspension, all sorts of things in there to be thinking about and to get your head around. Like I said, if you're unsure of any of it, just get in touch, ask a question. I'll do another video. It doesn't matter. Let's make good use of this time where we have it, and then hopefully at the other side we can actually get together and put it into practice in some way, shape or form. Okay, so thanks very much again for the questions. I'm sure I've got others to do. I'm pretty sure that Richard Weaver's asked me one that's more of a specific coaching question, which I'm looking forward to doing. And yeah, stay safe, stay healthy, keep washing your hands, keep up with the social distancing. I think the shops have all calmed down a bit now, which is nice, and hopefully we can get this thing lifted sooner rather than later and get back to doing the things that we love and enjoy. Okay, so until then, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.